My name is Daria Kowalik, and as the Executive Director of St. Volodymyr Institute, it's a real pleasure to welcome all of you here in person. June is National Indigenous History Month, a time to learn about the unique cultures, traditions, and experiences of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. It's a time to honor the stories, the achievements, and resilience of Indigenous peoples who have lived on this land since time immemorial. We'd like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which this event is being held, Toronto, is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. We encourage you to find out more about the land on which you live and work. It's important for us to start this event with a land acknowledgement because it gives time for reflection and demonstrates respect for Indigenous treaties, lands, and people. We're all accountable for honoring and respecting the history of our land. We're also grateful for the friendship and support that the Ukrainian Canadian settlers received from the Indigenous peoples when they first arrived. They continue to help Ukrainians today by contributing financially to help Ukraine in its current battle against the invaders, and also by raising awareness about the importance of respecting the shared past, specifically by wearing the kokam scarves, a symbol of humanity and resilience. We're dedicating this evening to our Indigenous friends, and any donations to the Native Canadian Centre of Toronto will be appreciated. Цей вечір буде проводитися переважно англійською мовою. At this time, please ensure your phones have been turned off or on silent, and please be aware that we are filming this event. We encourage you to ask questions as we go along into the Q&A time. Let me tell you a little bit about St. Volodymyr Institute, or SVI. It's a multifaceted institution here in downtown Toronto, housing a 46-room student residence and providing a home to over 10 organizations, including the Ukrainian Museum of Canada, Ontario branch, the Ukrainian Canadian Research and Documentation Centre, Seuss Foundation of Canada is founding organization. Recently, it's been home to 15 students from Ukraine studying in Canada, as well as 2 professors. This year, SVI is celebrating 60 years as a public cultural and educational center with a theater, library, and event spaces. And it's a community hub offering cultural programming, Ukrainian language lessons, and social events. Our 60th anniversary celebrations will occur on Sunday, October 22nd. Please put that into your calendar and join us. Cultural programming is key to SVI's vision, mission, history, and legacy. It's pivotal in strengthening the identity and community of individuals of Ukrainian descent while making an important contribution to the national culture of Canada. It's especially important as Ukraine defends its sovereignty, its culture, and its distinct identity. And that's why St. Volodymyr Institute is excited to be presenting this event with the Ukrainian Canadian Professional Business Federation. The Federation's mission is to unite, coordinate, and promote business and professional activities in the Ukrainian Canadian community. It's made up of member branches who organize events and initiatives at a local level. The UCPBF provides support to members in any way possible to aid in the planning and execution of their programming. The UCPBF also supports trade between Ukraine and Canada and actively engages government and civil society to further this cause. Our moderator this evening, Kasian Soltykevich, volunteers his time as the president of the Ukrainian Canadian Professional Business Federation and as the National Secretary of the Ukrainian Canadian Congress. He's the owner of Urban Block Media, a web development and marketing company, and Canadian Webinar Solutions, a webinar and online meeting production company. Kasian lives in Ottawa. Welcome, Kasian. Over to you.
Daria, thank you so much, and thank you all for being here this evening. And yes, a special thank you to SVI for hosting us, for making this evening a success and a reality. So thank you so much to all of you and for all of your support. So I'm very honored to be, after many discussions, emails, and everything, very honored to be here this evening to introduce to you, the authors of Valley of the Birdtail, Douglas Sanderson, Amo Benashi, and Andrew Stobo Snyderman. Our two authors, Douglas Sanderson is a beaver clan from the Opaskwayak Cree Nation, hopefully, and pretty good. Believe me, as the last name Soltikavich, we all try our best. Yes. It's the effort that's the most important part. He is a Fulbright Scholar and holds the Pritchard Wilson Chair in Law and Public Policy at the University of Toronto Faculty of Law. And Professor Sanderson has served as Senior Advisor to the Government of Ontario in the offices of the Attorney General and Aboriginal Affairs. And to his left, Andrew Stobo Snyderman is a writer, lawyer, Rhodes Scholar from Montreal. He has written for the New York Times, the Globe and Mail, and Maclean's. He has also argued before the Supreme Court of Canada, hopefully inside the building. I've only argued outside the building, and served as the Human Rights Policy Advisor to the Canadian Minister of Foreign Affairs and worked for a judge of South Africa's Constitutional Court. So this evening, two very prestigious authors and an excellent book that we have in front of us here, and we'll have for sale later as well. This evening we'll have a discussion with our authors, and we invite also all of you to ask questions, and we'll first have a little bit of discussion, then we'll get to some audience Q&A and intersperse into there. So in speaking with some of our audience members before we started here, some people have mentioned that they've already read the book, which is great to hear, and some people haven't, of course. So Douglas, I will post the first question to you to give us an overview about what the book's about, and just kind of for those people who here just learning for the first time.
All right. Thank you so much. And I want to say thank you so much for having us tonight. It's such a delight. I've passed by this place so many times in my work at the university. Always, what's going on in there? So I'm so happy to be here, getting on something in here. Valley of the Birdtail, with my co-author, Andrew Stobo Snyderman, is a history of Canada. And you can tell history a lot of different ways. You could look at really big pictures. We chose to tell the story in a very intimate way by following two families over about 150 years, right up until the present day. And one of those families are Ukrainian immigrants who populate a little town in Manitoba. Well, it becomes a town. It's just a place on the dirt originally. And it becomes Rossburn, Manitoba. And across the river, right across the valley, right around the same time, within a year or two, is founded the Weiwei-Sikapo Indian Reserve. And so what we do is we follow one family on reserve, one family off reserve, from the founding of the communities all the way through to the present day. And what that reveals is a kind of a terrible sort of thought experiment. And that experiment is this: like, what would happen if we took two communities and we established them more or less at the same time in more or less at the same place, and one community we helped. We provided decent education for their kids. We provided them access to markets. We provided them access to credit to be able to participate in the economy. We promoted their culture and we protected them. And then another group right across the river where we do exactly the opposite, where we provide really underfunded schools to people. We deny them participation in the economy. So like Indigenous people were not able to sell produce on reserve right up until 2014. And we took the kids. And what would happen if we ran that experiment? And it turns out what we get is the Canada we see all around us. So what we do with Valley of the Birdtail is, in telling the story of Canada, we show how it is that we ended up in this situation of massive inequality. We explain how that inequality happens, and we show that the inequality occurs as a result of conscious choices by government actors. So federal government officials, conservative and liberal, have chosen to, for example, underfund schools on reserves for this whole time. And so these are choices that we have made. And towards the end of the book, we talk about what other kinds of choices we might make, what that would really entail, what it would cost, and how it would benefit us all. I mean, how would we make a better Canada? And I think that's what the book's about.
Great. So it's a really good high-level overview. Kind of gives you the whole, it really is 170 years in 300 pages. and you tie it so well together between personal stories and historical facts that are just, things that you just kind of have to understand about the history of Canada. But maybe I'll even step back, even because I'm going to go in hopefully a little bit of a chronological order a little bit here. But even before we get into actually the writing of the book, I want to go a little bit more about how did the idea of the book come about, and a little bit more about maybe the building blocks of it. How often did you visit these areas? How did that those building blocks of this book coming together, and then those foundational pieces before we talk about kind of the nitty-gritty?
Thanks for that question. I also want to say I'm thrilled to be here and among hopefully some new friends to be. And I have a friend from South Africa here, and we have someone who may end up prosecuting Vladimir Putin to her left, who's working at the International Criminal Court. And we've got a gentleman who grew up in Rossburn who maybe we'll hear from later. So thrilled to be here. And I should say that my route to this book was as a Canadian who knew pretty much nothing about this stuff. And as I was growing up, what I heard was church officials and government officials apologizing for what had happened at residential schools. There were official and unofficial apologies, and it seemed like everyone was feeling really bad about what happened. And I happened to work as a journalist at this Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which was modeled after, in some ways, what happened in South Africa. And people were starting to tell these stories, and I started listening about 10 years ago. But it was when I was just studying down the road at U of T that I found out that whole time that Canada was making all these apologies, we kept treating all these children going to these really bad schools on reserves across this country really terribly. And there were about 100,000 young people going to schools that were getting about 50% less money than the public schools all across Ontario, for example. And this struck me as so deeply wrong. And at that point, it still felt kind of remote to me. So I started looking for a story to explain how wrong that was, because I think deep down, I really thought if we could just explain to more Canadians how wrong that was, people would come around to that. And that's how I came to Rossburn and Wewesi-Kapo, because it seemed like the perfect place to tell this story, because on the one hand, you had these communities really close to each other with these two schools that were dramatically unequal, and maybe we'll get to this later, but in the last 10 years, these places actually found a way to work together to make things better. So Douglas and I really wanted a story to help explain how everything went wrong and how we might work out of it. And I should add that this book started about schools, but it became way more ambitious over the years, and it became about the story of Ukrainians to Canada, which I'm sure we'll talk about today. It became a story about, law and economics, and how the government used its power to favor one community and to disfavor another. And as Douglas said, the ambition was to explain not just the story of schools, but why when we walk around this country, this city, why do we see the inequalities that we have? And I'll briefly mention something about the building blocks, which is that, this book's, the big sources are really dusty books in libraries and in archives. So it's me having very lonely, sad weekend nights in archives around this country. I love it, with little gloves, because the documents are all crumbling in my hands, talking to, the dead in these documents. And the other big piece is talking to people in this little town. Many, many Ukrainian Canadians, and eventually focusing on this one Ukrainian Canadian family, and a lot of time on this reserve, and getting people to trust this book project enough to share their lives with us. And I think what you'll find if you take a look at the book is a very intimate book about real people sharing their stories. And I'll conclude by saying that Douglas and I began to work together, I think it was about 3 years ago, because to really tell the story in a respectful and accurate way from the point of view of these two families, it became obvious that I couldn't do that myself. I had to have a co-equal writer to help do that together. And so we're very different people, And we've worked together to bring these stories into one larger whole about Canada from the point of view of these two communities.
All right, thank you. So that's really good background to kind of have a place that footing so you understand where we're starting from and where we're coming from, and especially someone who's found interest in this, and of course we're growing up and you hear these Truth and Reconciliation Commission coming out and you're hearing apologies, but kind of going, okay, well, done, right? Like we've checked it off, we've done the thing, and now we can move on. But not even at all. We've just even started to scratch the surface of changing things. So I'm going to go now back to, I want to follow maybe a little bit of what we'll do is we'll follow a little bit about the chronological timeline and how we'll end up at education today. We talk about the last 10 years and how that ends up at the end of the book. But maybe let's start off even in the late 19th century, where we have indigenous groups, and we have just the beginnings of the first 1,000 Ukrainians or Galicians at that time arriving into Canada. And they are now both in Canada, kind of the government of Canada, the Dominion of Canada is going, all right, we got these kind of people, but they're out there on the prairies, and we have settlers who have to farm the land. We need to, settle this land, and we need to have people on here, because also at the same time we have Americans and others trying to conquer this land. Everyone's trying to fight, and we bring these people together. So what was that, you're trying to distill these two different pieces, and really you have the Dominion of Canada trying to control these two different groups in two different ways. Because then we started approaching the First World War, where we have indigenous people fighting for the Dominion of Canada, for the British Empire, and we have Ukrainians also who want to fight. And let's talk a little bit more. Maybe you can talk a little bit about your research and your dive into how indigenous people were treated returning out from the war, and also how Ukrainians were treated, who I'm sure some people in this room, I'm sure many would know about internment. So maybe talk a little bit more about your research into those two pieces and how those different streams, but also at the same time we're feeling both pressures from both.
So thanks for that. And I want to say that this, the story of the Ukrainian population of Canada, it was to me the most revealing and surprising aspect of the book and the research. And, often when I learn stuff, I'm surprised that I'm surprised. So, my dad was in the Air Force as a kid, so I lived in a lot of prairie towns, and there were always enormous numbers of Ukrainians. Always had Ukrainian neighbors, always eating dessert pierogies, which I had no idea existed. And we would also travel across the prairies on summer vacation. So we'd always pass Vegreville, pass the Big Egg. And, never once did I ever stop and think, why? Why in particular are there so many Ukrainians? It just never occurred to me to ask. And in the background growing up, there was always this trope of Ukrainian Canadians. It's all across the country. But again, no idea. And so Valley of the Birdtail tells that story of Canadian immigration. And it's a story that starts in the 19th century. And we can actually tie together the indigenous population and the Ukrainian population through one man. A guy named Clifford Sifton, who was Minister of the Interior at the turn of the century. And so he has two main jobs. And I'll talk about the first one, and I'll leave Stoba the second one. So the first job for the Minister of the Interior, Canada is really in the east at this point. We're not much past Toronto in terms of, when you read about in oldie books like the Northwest, I always imagined it was the Northwest Territories, but it's Manitoba. Right? And so the first task of the Minister of the Interior is to clear the prairies. And so in order to do that, he commissions a guy named Moores to go out and sign what are known as the numbered treaties. And these are unlike all of the treaties that came before, which are mostly all pretty reasonable, and they were all based in discussions between the parties. But that was when the British were doing the treaties. They went home, and Canada became a dominion. And that government instituted a regime of treaties that was very much unlike the prior regime. It was a regime that was designed to move Indians off the land and onto reserves. And it was designed to break up the indigenous population into small, scattered communities, so the political power base would be diffused across the prairies. And promises were made of all kinds to indigenous peoples, none of which happened. And the reason for that is because the Supreme Court of Canada has taken the view in treaty interpretation that no matter what got said or what got promised, and no matter what you can prove, it doesn't matter. What matters are the words on the page. Now, the indigenous signatories don't speak English for the most part. The translators are really, really bad. And all the numbered treaties contain a provision called the Taking Up Clause. And what the Taking Up Clause says is that indigenous people are free to use their land for all of their regular avocations until such time as the land is needed to be taken up for development. All the land. And so that's the mechanism by which all of the land outside of Indian reserves gets transferred to the federal crown. So now we've depopulated the prairies, and now step two. All right. Step two, back to Clifford Sifton, Minister of the Interior. He seeks out a population that he thinks is going to be durable enough to survive Canadian winters. He actually at one point thinks about, like, maybe we shouldn't publish the temperature on the prairies anymore. Yeah, because, like, people don't want to know. And in particular, he settles on Ukrainians, in part because they're farmers in Ukraine, because they're oppressed, they're looking to flee, they're being oppressed by the Russians at the time. And so he puts together a program of immigration that sends out agents from Canada all across Eastern Europe to find Ukrainian immigrants. And they're transported to Germany, where they're put onto boats. The Canadian government pays for the passage through to Halifax, then the train trip from Halifax all the way to Winnipeg. Then each of these families is given a cart with flour and a tent and some sugar, and for $10 they can have 160 acres of land. And Clifford Sifton has to protect these Ukrainian immigrants. They are regarded as, like, people call them dogs and animals. They call them Sifton's pets. They suffer incredible racism. But Clifford Sifton protects them. He demands that these people, you should rise to become Ukrainian Canadians. You have to preserve your language. You have to preserve your dance. You have to preserve your customs. You have to integrate them into Canadian culture. At the very same time, on Indian reserves, Clifford Sifton is making it illegal to engage in traditional activities like dancing and ceremony. He's making it impossible for people to participate in the economy. He is providing really substandard education, to the extent they're providing education at all in those days. And so in this one character, right, we see, like, the very best of Canada, what we want Canada to be, proactively going, finding the oppressed, bringing them to Canada, setting them up on their own. And then, just like Canada, oppressing an indigenous population, trying to repress all of those same values that you're trying to promote within the Ukrainian community. And so Clifford Sifton at one time stands as, like, he's a very 19th century sort of character. But, if you look at our current policies, right, we have extended extra special immigration policies to Ukrainians today. There's a war. Of course we should do that. But there's also a war in Darfur, and a war in Sudan, and a war in Syria, and we don't make that extra special step. And so there's a way in which, although we look at Clifford Sifton, we think, oh, he's so 19th century, there's a way in which he really is just us today. We're still doing the same thing. We're doing some of the things that are right, but we also have blind spots. And Clifford Sifton, I think, is a great example of how those blind spots can arise. And if we follow forward, how much inequality can result as a result of that initial treatment.
Nothing to add, Stobo? No. Okay, I'm gonna keep building on that, because we're talking about you mentioned that Clifford Sifton and how having they're hoping that these newcomers, these Ukrainians, would overwhelm the population and they would change the way of life for Indigenous people. And maybe while the Ukrainians are looking like the half-breeds at the time. Maybe we'll assimilate them. We'll become the more Canadian, so to speak, and then they will also change the Indigenous people in turn. And you also mentioned, preventing ceremony and dancing, but also something very, very poignant in the book was preventing, I don't even know about, they couldn't hire lawyers. They're also barred from doing that, which is probably literally like even countries that are so oppressive and they have sham courts, you could still have a lawyer even though you have countries that have sham courts, some of which we know very well about. But even that, like that basic human right was denied to them about such a simple thing. And it really was those deliberate policies about keeping them down, keeping the Indian down. Like you mentioned, no machinery for farming, couldn't sell produce. And something maybe we could expand a little bit about in the book, talking about the farming practices, because Ukrainians were, one thing you also did miss that was also Clifford Sitton really liked about Ukrainians was they had a lot of kids.
Oh, yeah.
Because something that...
Unprotected sex, excellent experts. Yes.
Something that I think some people, we talk about, Ukrainians are good farmers, but we don't realize at the time that there's so many Ukrainians, and the only way that you have in Ukraine at the time, or in Galicia and that area, the only way that you keep going is as you have kids, you divide your land up, and it's just exponential diminishing. So you have 160 acres.
It was
inevitable.
Yeah.
They had to go somewhere. It's true. They had to go to South America. They had to go to North America because you're going, well, I have 4 kids and I have 40 acres. Well, they all get 10 acres, and then they're all going to have 4 kids, and then 3 and you have kids at like 22.
How come you didn't take over Russia?
Have you tried to farm in like 90% of their country? It's quite difficult. But so maybe talk a little bit about that, the farming aspect and how much they wanted to, how important that was for the Ukrainians coming to farm and then going from traditional indigenous way of hunting, gathering, and how that kind of played out.
Yeah, I think maybe I'll just draw out this Jekyll and Hyde thing that's going on. So just to give a couple concrete examples. As Douglas was saying, if you were an immigrant to Canada, if you were Ukrainian Canadian, you had a deal so that for $10, you got 160 acres if you promised to work the land. And of course, once you have land, you can get loans to build a house, to start a business. But it literally says in the law, if you're an Indian, you can't get a homestead. It was written into law that if you lived on a reserve, and Douglas mentioned this earlier, it was illegal for you to sell anything that you grew on a reserve unless you had the signed permission of a federal agent. And there's this picture of one of these permits that I invite everyone to look at to kind of see it. You have to see it to kind of believe it. And it was a permit that was written out in 1947 for a man to sell a load of barley. And this man's name was Hugh McKay. He had just spent 4 years fighting Nazis in Europe, was wounded, almost killed, comes back to Canada, and then he needs permission from some federal agent to sell a load of barley. And his son, who's alive today, remembers times when his father was denied a permit and the humiliation of that. And across the river in this little town, the government builds a rail stop so that it's very easy to get your products to market. For a time, the government made it illegal to use modern farming equipment on the reserve. So you literally had to use scythes. You weren't even allowed to have nails. You couldn't use lanterns at night. And there was this idea that if you just made it even harder to do the work, with hard work, you would become virtuous and you would become civilized. On the one hand, they were saying, you need to farm to become civilized, but we're not going to let you do it efficiently. And you will not be surprised to hear that they could not compete with the farmers in the town. And of course, that was part of the point. And so literally at the same time, you have farmers in the town pooling their resources to buy, machinery that could do the work in a much more efficient way. And I think I'd like to kind of cut to the heart of what I'm hoping we can think together about tonight and maybe going forward, which is something I continue to struggle with in my mind, which is kind of the relationship between these Ukrainian immigrants and their indigenous neighbors. And I think we're trying to do 2 things in this book. One of them is to say there's actually a lot of parallels. People come to this country, as most of the people in this room know, and they're not considered white, literally as pale as Ukrainians are. They're called all kinds of horrible names. They're discriminated against in newspapers, in employment, all kinds of ways. And they faced real racism for a long time, decades. And I'm sure your families may still talk about it today. And Cassian was referring to the fact that during World War I, as most of you I'm sure know, there was an internment of a vast number of Ukrainian men in this country because the Ukraine was allied with the Tsar in Europe and the Germans, and they were our enemy, and we had to diffuse that threat. And so people were interned, and in some cases they built our national parks with almost unpaid labor. If you go to Banff National Park, that's thanks to Ukrainian Canadians, and they were put into prison camps, and we put a picture of imprisoned white Ukrainians so that people today can be remembered. It's a story that's less well known outside of Ukrainian Canadian circles. And so there's a way in which we want the reader to see the parallels between that discrimination and discrimination that is faced by Indigenous people. And there's even a character in the story, a young and Indigenous woman, who, as she's learning about her own history, is also fascinated to learn some of these stories about Ukrainians. And there's this common ground that is powerful, and I think it happens across the prairies, where I think Ukrainian Canadians and Indigenous people, they find these commonalities. But there's also this other thing going on, which I saw a lot of, which is not just Ukrainians, but I would say immigrants to this country, who, I'll talk more from the point of view of my family, where we would say who are coming from Eastern Europe and Western Europe. And the view is, we arrived with nothing, and over time we worked really hard, and over time we succeeded. We did really well. Oh, and these Indigenous people, yeah, it's true that they started with nothing, but they still have nothing. So we must be doing something right, and they must be doing something wrong. And we tell the stories of people in this town who are grandchildren of and great-grandchildren of Ukrainian immigrants who accept all these stereotypes in their minds about their neighbors, who don't actually have conversations with their Indigenous neighbors, or don't have any friends, even though they live literally next door. But they assume all these things. And so there's this paradoxical commonality that almost distances people. It's like sometimes you can see the commonalities and it brings you together, and sometimes you see the commonalities and it brings people apart because they attribute their success to themselves and the failures to the other people. And I think the real ambition of this book is for everyone to read it and to kind of revisit some of these assumptions, to explain, as Douglas was saying, why are we so unequal today? And I think a big part of that story, if not the vast majority of that story, it's not just people worked really hard and they persevered, though of course many people did. It's that the dice were loaded generation after generation, policy after policy, and it makes a fundamental difference in how the world is today.
You know, you mentioned the different immigrant groups, and it's very true. I had these kinds of conversations with friends and family growing up. Exactly what you said. Exactly said. We made it. Why can't they? And it's actually, I even thought about not only so much about why can't we make it, but also a lot of immigrant. And this is kind of a problem with Canada that's been the history, was kind of every immigrant group kind of had their trouble to go through. Ukrainians had internment. Of course, not all of them were interned, but this was a part that hit that cultural group. Japanese were interned. Chinese head tax, Emma St. Louis, Komaru Maru, like all those different pieces, and then kind of eventually after each group has their so-called big difficulty, it kind of we overcome and then we move on. And then we go, okay, that group has now arrived. Great, you're happy you're a Canadian, we move on. And then like the next immigration group has its difficulty, and then it's kind of like, how do we get rid of that difficulty part? And I think now finally there's a change in public mood. I think finally in this generation, and young people especially, students I talk to nowadays are much more aware of issues amongst Indigenous communities, and that 157 years of the dice being exactly stacked against them, everything. There wasn't an equal footing and an equal ground to be able to grow and to start up on. And something you also mentioned that I also wrote down was about they are literally, they're across the valley from each other and sharing the same bus and not knowing each other's names. That was such a poignant moment that going, have you ever talked to them? Have you ever asked them a question going, my uncle said this at the Thanksgiving dinner. Is this true? And two books that I thought...
Your uncle says that Thanksgiving is never true.
No, it's true. Especially as... Exactly. Oh, actually, my uncles... Oh, I shouldn't say about my uncles. I enjoy my uncles, but yes. One side, whatever. Anyways, but I think there's a growing awareness, and I think it's so important about, even some of these more simple books that people just have all these stereotypes. And one, for example, Indigenous Rights by Chelsea Vowell, I think was such a simple book that you go... Just so many basic questions that are just answered. 21 things that you may not know about the Indian Act by Bob Joseph. These I see these much more books coming out that are going, let's just start with the basics, like fundamentals. Let's learn from one another about let's break these barriers, break these truths, and realize what the true parts really are. So let's go, those things are all education. All educating yourself, but let's go about education at this one major thing before we'll talk about, which is really most of the book. Before we go to audience Q&A, let's talk about education, because that is the biggest piece of the book and how it goes from residential schools all the way to today. So maybe let's talk a little bit about history, and then let's move into, we can talk secondly about how we get to present day, and then the third part being about the last 10 years.
Okay, so I want to talk about the law just for a minute, because we got to get past this one part.
It's only something you do daily. You only teach it, so it's only appropriate.
So the Canadian Constitution has something called the division of powers, and what that does is it provides provinces with a set of governing powers that are exclusive to them. Right. So the federal government has a different set of powers. One of the federal powers is Section 9124, and it says that Indians and lands reserved for Indians are the sole responsibility of the federal crown. Section 92 of the Constitution Act says that education is the responsibility of the provinces, right? And so all across the provinces and territories, the school districts are all run provincially. But provinces have taken the view that because of 9124, they are not responsible for educating Indigenous children on reserve. And so that means that to the extent there's an education system, it's paid for by the federal government on reserve. So this is how we end up with a residential school system, right? You have two different sets of governments running institutions that are supposed to be doing the same thing, but they're not working together. And it's also the case that in a provincial school system, when something, when funding gets cut or, teacher salaries are too low or whatever it is, parents rise up, they're outraged. It affects everyone in the province. When funding on an Indian reserve gets cut, no one notices. I mean, we're a tiny portion of the population, less than 5%. We're scattered around. And, governments don't even really cut our funding. They just stop increasing it with respect to inflation. So that slowly over years you get less and less and less. The feds also instituted a 2% funding cap in the 90s, and they kept it in place way beyond the time when all the other ministries were getting full funding. Indian Affairs stayed this little tiny amount at 2%, and that's got to fund education. So that's how we end up with provincial schools and then federal schools, and I'll let Stobo talk a little bit about the history of that schooling systems.
Thanks, Douglas. This school stuff was all new to me. So I think all of us perhaps are more familiar with this story about residential schools, where there were these separate schools where kids were kidnapped from their families and sent away. But there's this other stuff that happens, which I don't think we hear that much about. And what happened after that was that students were transferred into provincial public schools. There was this integration movement where all of a sudden the federal government says, you know what, it's really expensive to run separate schools. Let's just have everyone go to the same schools together, which actually sounds not so bad maybe. But when that happened in the 60s and the 70s and the early 80s, and perhaps some of the people in this room were part of this, a bunch of indigenous students would come to a school, and the schools did a terrible, terrible job of treating them with any kind of dignity. And the dropout rates were astronomical. I think in this one community we're writing about, there was one high school graduate in 17 years, or something, between 65 and 82. And the parents of this community got together and they said, our kids are not stupid. Something is wrong here. And that's why they set up their separate school. And I think there's a gentleman in the back whose family was present when this was happening in Wew'suwet'en in Rossburn, where all of a sudden in the summer of 1982 in this place, all the indigenous children were pulled out of the school and they set up their entirely separate school. And that's, to some extent, the way it is today, up until high school. And I just want to take us a moment to pause on how troubling this is, I think, because on the one hand, it makes perfect sense, I think, that this community felt like we need to do things separately or no one's going to treat us with any kind of care. But at the same time, the federal government, as I said at the very beginning of tonight, was giving them 40, 50% less funding per child. And these communities know that. So they have this awful choice to make. Are we going to have these separate, underfunded schools where we can't retain teachers, where we don't have basic equipment to give, we can't give textbooks to our kids, but at least we could put them in an environment where they're not going to be treated with racism every day. And that's what they chose for decades. And that's pretty much how it was in Canada until, I think, very recently, where funding has more or less increased. And I want to take a moment to say what happened that's really exciting about these schools in these particular places, which is that 10 years ago, they started working together to try to address this basic problem. And they reached an agreement, yeah.
Can I just say maybe but specifically this community?
Yeah.
Not
just this community. Not everywhere else.
Not the hundreds,
so
not nationwide.
Exactly.
This
There's this kind of fairy tale that I read about in the newspaper 10 years ago that said, all of a sudden, all these indigenous children are going to have equal funding for their schools. It's great. And if you scratch beyond the surface a little bit, it's actually not as inspiring as it may look, because the outcome is great. And it turns out that if you give indigenous children decent schools, all of a sudden, they start reading and performing in math a lot better really quickly, and they start doing well. But it turns out the reason why that agreement came to place is not because everyone in this town realized how morally wrong it was. It wasn't like, oh, we all of a sudden realized that this school was facing all these hardships. They kind of knew all along, and it was obvious. The reason they started cooperating is because more and more families were leaving the town and the surrounding area, and they were desperate for more children to be part of their school division to save the jobs of the teachers and to keep their own schools open. And so they end up working together out of total self-interest. You could take that as a really sad, negative story, and I think Douglas and I prefer to look at it in this way, which is that Canada, in fact, is in this situation. We don't see it in such stark terms. We're not forced to confront that, but it actually makes no sense. It's very stupid for us to allow 50% graduation rates for all these kids on reserve, which is still true today, because those children end up, they're in our country too. And if they don't do well, no one does well. So I'm hoping that one other thing you get out of this book is that that people get out of this book is that we have a common interest at stake, and it's okay to think of it in that way. And if we do, we might be more invested in our neighbors. And education is just one example of that. And I'm sure if people follow the news a bit, they know that there's still not drinking water on reserves all across this country. You know that, special education services are bad. Child welfare services are bad. Across the board, it's much worse in these places, and it's not good for anyone.
Absolutely. And I think we'll open up to the floor for questions. And the last thing I'll say is I think just education, though, is such a great choice for this to focus on this, because education is the building block of life. Without the education, it's hard to study further, it's hard to get a better job, it's hard to every single other thing in life. So it's the key part of your life. If you don't have it, everything else becomes so much harder. So I'll take this mic and I'll run it around and then ask some questions.
How much time have we got, just so I have a sense of it, or maybe the audience has a sense of it?
I don't know.
Good.
As much as you like, but as long as people stay.
Great.
So. Ukrainians are infamous for holding events that go on for far too long. So we'll make sure it's not too long.
We've got time. We're in no rush.
Thank you. This was actually very eye-opening and quite interesting. We're definitely going to be picking up a book after this, but because I want to read more about this, knowing only a part of one side of the story and very little of the second side of the story. What I was going to say is that you mentioned that the new immigrants came with nothing and built stuff up, but I think it's important to recognize also that the indigenous people, in fact, had everything taken away first before they ended up with nothing. And then, so, I mean, there's an extra step to this that creates the inequality. And my question is, specifically to the education, is this problem fixable short of a constitutional change? And for the average Canadian, do you speak with your federal representative or your provincial one to get a change? Like, where's the more effective way to seek change? Because honestly, if at this point Indigenous children are still getting underfunded, it's 2023. It's a little bit we got to hurry up and change some of this stuff, I think.
So thanks for that super great question. And so Stowe and I are writing the book, and we get to the story of Rossburn, and we get to the story of the two communities coming together. And, one of the things that, bear this in mind, so we spoke to federal officials about this arrangement. And one of the things they said is, this was only possible because it was so little money, right? Like in this one community, and, a little bit of money, like let's just do a little math, right? 200 students, $4,000 a head, that's $800,000 that school's not getting, like $1 million. So we got to that point, and then, increased funding and all of the kids' scores start to improve. Yay! So, that's the answer, right? And pens down. But we both realized pretty quickly that, the funding is just discretionary, right? It's literally someone said, oh, that's not very much money. I guess we can cover it. But if you tried to expand that across the country, it would become enormously expensive. And so, and even if you did do that, you'd end up in this problem that we've seen happen over and over and over again, which is just that funding for Indigenous stuff slides. And because we're a tiny percent of the population, nobody really notices. And it doesn't affect anybody else, right? Not in the way that school funding generally does. So what we sort of came to realize is that there are structural problems with the Canadian Federation in terms of how citizens, Indigenous citizens in particular, have access to resources and governance. And so we sort of came to this idea that the way we would make sure that Indian children always got decent funding for their schools would be to put their communities in charge of allocating that funding. And one way that you could do that is if you provided Indigenous communities access to land which they could tax, right? Because that's what governments do. All governments just tax people, industries. They raise that money, they spend it on, fixing roads, libraries, whatever. Indigenous communities don't work like that. Like, we are more or less statutorily prohibited from raising our own income through taxation. It's very difficult to do on an Indian reserve. And that means all the money just flows from the federal government if you want it. So why is the water systems broken? Right? Do the communities not want them fixed? No, they desperately want them fixed. but they have no authority to raise the money to spend on that. So they have to go to the federal government and go like, would you fix our water system? They're like, it's pretty expensive, actually, especially when there's so many of them. They are getting better at it. And so the proposals that we look to at the end are ways of rethinking governance over territory and who's benefiting from those resources. So we imagine that, like in places in the north where there's only, there's hardly any non-Indians, it would make sense for those areas to come under a different order of government, an indigenous government that would be in charge of regulating industry. So it would be that indigenous governments that would raise money from forestry or from mining or tourism. And where they're doing really well, we want them to pay the provinces because the provinces are going to lose out in this scheme, right? And we're conscious of that. And we know that there's no point in putting forward a plan if we're not going to be able to generate political support for it. So we need to be conscious of the fact that we're actually asking people, we're saying to you that reconciliation isn't free. It's going to have a cost. But we want to show you how we can do this in a way that is structurally fair to everyone. And actually just, if you think about Canada now, Ontario here, there's like $1 billion worth of forestry money that comes to the province every year, like just an enormous amount of wealth. And what that means is that Toronto is effectively funded by the North. And that's true all across Canada. It's the resource-rich North that pays the taxes into federal and provincial coffers that fund the cities of the South. So all we're really proposing is to just make that visible. Just let Indigenous people step into a role where they're collecting resources and distributing it. It is the case that the Canadian Constitution has a principle called equalization, and it's a federal commitment to equality, so that the idea is that every Canadian, no matter where you are, no matter where you live, should have equal access to government services, whether in Prince Edward Island or Nunavut, doesn't matter. And so that principle applies everywhere in Canada. Everyone has access more or less to the same level of healthcare, except on an Indian reserve. They're excluded from that equalization formula. So there's a way in which we confederated a nation, but we left Indigenous people out in a really fundamental way. And so what we're trying to do is find a way to bring them into an economic confederation. And the way we do that is through allowing those governments to be the ones who tax the resources, raise the money, and then spend it on their citizens, instead of a system where money has to flow from the federal government every time you want to do something. Like, imagine if Toronto was like that, right? If you wanted your potholes fixed and you had to write the province and say, it's really bumpy, can you please come fix it? And no one there cares, because they're never going to drive on those roads. So the answer is, I think, really that this is a large sort of political problem, but we think it's one that is actually resolvable. And there just has been a real lack of big picture thinking about ideas about how to solve these large problems. And we've instead focused on these little problems that all seem intractable. So our solution then is we would like people to really advocate with their federal representatives and ask, what is the plan? And when they go, well, we're going to increase funding for education, go no, that's not, yes, please, but that's not enough. That can't be enough. The way we're going to fix the education is the same way we fixed the clean running water, which is the same way we fixed child welfare. And that's putting those communities in a position to be able to fund those government services themselves, rather than relying on a distant and cold federal government who has no real stake in that community.
So I'd like to make an observation and ask a question. So my name is Kim Hyun. I grew up in Rossburn. My family, we came to Rossburn in December 1982, and we were there until June 1993. So one thing, it's really interesting to hear this. So I wanted to add a nuance. So there's a story in the book about in 1991, 1990, some of the Indigenous students were thinking of returning to the school. They actually came for the first day of school, and their vehicles were vandalized. And I just want to add color to that because one of the parties that committed the vandalism was actually a person who had a Ukrainian father and an indigenous mother. And this is where sometimes how laws are made can create divisions. So, for example, the reason the students who had a Ukrainian father and an indigenous mother went to our school was that his mother was disenfranchised. So, once a female indigenous person married a non-indigenous person, they were out. And so we never really discussed it with this student, but I think there was this feeling of exclusion because they were not part of their cultural identity, and they were living in one part of the society. So I think that's the observation I thought that would be useful to think about, because these, once again, the implications of the laws that are on the books. So that's my observation. I thought I'd share that with everybody. And then my question is, you talk about empowerment, of how can we help, about taxing, giving the ability to tax. So one of the organizations out there is the Toutle Center of Indigenous Economics in Kamloops, BC. And one of the things that's they proposed is under the First Nations tax authority. As I don't get all the facts right. Can you correct me? So what are your thoughts about that, or that movement to allow reserves to exit the Indian Act and become fully self-governed?
Yeah, so this is an institute run by a really great guy named Manny Jules, who is an economist. He's an indigenous guy, and he's really onto this idea of taxation. And the thing to bear in mind about the proponents of this vision is that they're all living on really sweet real estate, right? So like Manny Jules Reserve is like around Kelowna. So he's got a winery, he's got a fishing resort on his community. Other communities in North Vancouver that lease land to shopping malls and stuff, they're all in favor of this. So there's a way for some communities, this is a potential way out and to integrate to Canadian society on their own terms, which I can't fault them for. But that's not really a solution. That only applies to places that are already super rich in land and resources, right? So it's not adding to more wealth. It's just allowing that existing wealth in those little reserves. And I say they're little, and they are 0.05% of the land base of Canada, so they're really, really tiny. But if you've got, 1,000 acres in prime real estate area, you can generate a lot of economy. And what we're trying to do is just provide more communities with more land and more valuable land in order to be able to put themselves in the same situation as those much smaller but resource-rich communities.
Thank you so much. I am wondering what the response from the residents of Rossburn has been to the book. I know oftentimes I work specifically in Indigenous Ukrainian relations in East Central Alberta, and so one of the things I often hear is a lot of kickback from Ukrainian communities asking or saying that they were represented in a light that isn't always really positive. And so I'm wondering what the reaction from the Rossburn residents are, and how you deal with any sort of negative kickback.
Can you say a little bit more about the kickback you're talking about?
Oftentimes, I think that although you don't necessarily say it in the book, but there is a perception that racism runs really rampant in Rossburn. And so, be that past, present, or future. And so there is often a perception that when you call someone out on their racism, that it's, that in and of itself is sort of a criticism, that it ends up being looked at very negatively by the community, and oftentimes folks stop listening.
Yeah,
So I'm wondering how you deal with that.
Yeah. So I know exactly what you're talking about. And I think there's a clear choice in this book that we make, which is not to swipe all these people aside and say, oh, they're a bunch of rural racists. They must be a bunch of imbeciles. Ukrainians, non-Ukrainians, the white farmer idiots. I think we're very interested in what they think and why they think it. And so you'll find a chapter, or a couple chapters, trying to understand the point of view of someone who thinks, I think people on reserve are actually being treated pretty well. They're being treated differently, and I don't like that they're being treated differently. We should all be treated the same. And I think we try to very respectfully see where that person is coming from. And I think it's not a ridiculous thing to think that actually we should have the exact same rules for everyone and not to want to treat with any difference Indigenous people in this country. And there's a particular character in this book named Brian Brown, who was the mayor of this town, who is seen as a very conservative person. And I spend a lot of time with Brian, and I think he's actually a pretty good guy. And he articulates in this book a lot of the views which some people might call racist. And I tried to get inside his head, or we try to present his views, and then we respond to them. And we try to respond, for example, to a commonly held belief, which wasn't Brian Brown's, that, for example, Indigenous people don't pay tax. I heard that my entire life, and it turns out that almost always they're paying the same taxes as everyone else, and there's very narrow exceptions that shouldn't get anyone in a tizzy. But we try to unpack, for example, that view that, oh, people aren't paying taxes. And more fundamentally, this view that we shouldn't be treating anyone differently, we should all be treated the same, which, by the way, Pierre Elliott Trudeau spent his whole career an idea defending, and I think the people who say that kind of thing today are branded as racists, and people don't really engage with them. And Brian Brown, when I went to Rossburn when this book came out, unfortunately had COVID, so he couldn't come, but I spoke to him a few days before, and his wife came to ask for a book to be signed for her husband. And so I think that's a pretty good sign, that the most conservative person, who most people in the reserve think is a racist, is treated with enough respect in this book to feel like at least his views got heard. He doesn't agree with where we end up on the book, but I think he felt respected. And so, and at a bigger level, I think that's really important, and maybe that's part of your work, to deal with that kickback, as you put it, to actually try to hear where people are coming from, to recognize that they're not crazy, no one sets out to be a racist, but they have a worldview that we need to engage with, and maybe we actually have to change it sometimes, because it turns out it's a part of one part of the story, as I think one of our friends was saying earlier.
So let me just say that, so facts matter a lot, and it can be really hard to get good information, and information that you trust and can rely on. And so we try and do that, as Stobo says. But I think that the racism piece, and it works both ways, right? And actually you'll see in the book that there are characters on the Indigenous side as well as on the Rossburn side who change and grow and learn more about their neighbors and feel ashamed about the way they felt in the past. But I think the real key is you have to combine that full information with what Stobo was saying earlier, which is like, I acknowledge you as my neighbor have had a really hard time in the past, that you struggled hard. But until you see the structural pieces that are keeping the other community down, until you can bring yourself to say like, oh, it's not their fault. That's the hump we need to get over. And so we think we approach that in the book by, one, providing the full information, but then showing how those communities, players in the communities, come to learn about each other's histories and their families and really begin to change. And so I think that these are difficult conversations. This is really hard to do, but I think we need to provide like full information along with a sensitivity to the realities of that other community. And, Ukrainians should feel proud about all that they've achieved in this nation. It's just you also have to set that aside against indigenous people have had structure and continue to have structural inequalities. So, for example, you can't sell produce. Like, that was 2014 when we were like, okay, Indians, you can sell produce now. And the access to credit. Like, you still can't get a loan from a bank if you live on a reserve. It's just impossible, which means none of those communities can start their own businesses. They can't buy homes off reserve. And so learning about those things, and in fact, I think for many people, like, that one piece is like, if like you could have a high school education and work in a garage, right, as a mechanic. And one day you go to buy that garage, you go to the bank. When that guy learns that his neighbors can't do even that, it affects people, right? So I think it's just a matter of like honest truth-telling and really accepting and learning about the other communities.
Anybody else?
Thank you for your presence here. I would like to know, because of the problems in funding the Indigenous people for in education and everything that they require, what is the status of the 99 plus years of litigation with the federal government and the Indigenous? Have the Indigenous people received anything from the lawsuit that has been going on for 99 plus years with the federal?
Which one? There's so many. And I want the audience to know that we've agreed to dance later, so I'm going to hold you to that. I think there's many lawsuits, and I think Douglas and I are both lawyers, although non-practicing lawyers now, and I want to say that a lot of the progress we've seen in the last 40 years is because people turned to courts, because it was harder for judges to be as discriminatory as our politics is. And so there have been meaningful decisions that have forced the government to do things differently. And for example, there have been a recent series of decisions which didn't take 100 years, but took about 10 years, to tell the federal government it is discrimination if you give less funding for a basic service like child welfare on reserves. And people are going to keep building on that to try to get better access to water and better schools. And there are, unfortunately, many legal battles, and maybe you're referring to one of them, where it's been going on a long, long time. I think there was a settlement in Ontario for a dispute that's been going on for like over 100 years. So that was kind of a rare spot. But I want to conclude by saying that people turned to the courts because no one else was listening, but we cannot sue our way out of this problem. The law kind of provides some avenues in our society for minorities to get the government to do stuff, but lawyers are not going to save us. The courts are not going to save us. We have to save ourselves. And we have to somehow convince a big enough group of Canadians and deal with the kickback that we can do better. And I think somehow this political project is what we need to start focusing our energies on. And there are many brilliant lawyers who will probably be suing the government for another 99 years. But in the meantime, there's a lot we can do, and we hope this book is a little part of everyone's project of being a part of that.
Thank you, Stobo. And that's difficult to talk about. I hope lawyers don't keep suing one another to lawyers. But you always want a lawyer when you need one, but you generally don't want to receive a letter from another lawyer. I'll say that. But thank you so much for your questions, and I think and for the really good discussion. And Douglas, I think you made a really good point about the examples, the very human examples. I think that's such a, you hear just these blanket statements, and it's very easy to go, oh, just blanket statements. It's very difficult to kind of pinpoint it down. But when you hear that story about, yeah, this guy can't get a mortgage. He wants to buy a condo, wants to buy a house. Impossible, literally impossible. Can't get a small business loan. Can't even borrow $10,000 to start up, a small startup, something that, you don't even think about. You go to your, as we have a representative from the Ukrainian Credit Union here, you go to your local Ukrainian Credit Union, and then you go ask for a loan and make it happen. And I think just those really human stories are so important, and those really things that you would never really think about. I think most Canadians, or the vast majority, know about residential schools and about the clean water boil advisories. All these kinds of things I think are coming into light, but some of those basic things that you don't even think about are so important to get out there. So I want to thank all of you so much for coming. We have some books for sale that I think we'll have some signing as well. Continue the discussion. Thank you, Douglas, and thank you, Stobo, for being here, for making this happen. Thank you to SVI. This is so grateful. I think Daria has some concluding remarks. Yes.
That's great. Thank you very much, Cassiana. So thank you, Douglas and Andrew, for sharing this story, your motivation for writing the book, and giving us a deeper understanding of the ongoing challenges for Indigenous people. This was very eye-opening, for me at least personally. Thank you, Cassian, for suggesting this event and for so ably moderating our discussion. We also thank the Ukrainian Professional Business Federation for co-presenting the event with us. And thanks to Peter Dudka for filming this event this evening. St. Volodymyr Institute gratefully acknowledges the generous support of the Shevchenko Foundation, Ukrainian Canadian Veterans Fund, the SUS Foundation of Canada, and Delta Bingo and Gaming. And while participation to this event was free, donations are appreciated and will be passed along to the Native Canadian Centre of Toronto. So thank you for joining us. We hope to see you again. Slava Ukraini, and buy a book if you're interested. Thank you.